I would like now to invite our third presenter, William Dorrell, a theoretical neuroscientist with a PhD from UCL, University College London, who is currently a research fellow at the Kempner Institute of Harvard. The title of, his presentation is Mirrors Between the Neural Basis of Natural and Artificial Cognition. William, the floor is yours. Thank you.
So when biology and technology try and solve the same problem, they often end up with radically different solutions. A canonical example of this is flight. So birds flapping and planes taking off solve the problem in very different ways, largely because birds are not able to biology doesn't have engines with the same power to weight ratio as planes, so they can't move fast enough to generate the airflow to generate lift. And so this is an example of a shared problem, flying in a world with a fixed set of laws of fluid dynamics, solved in very different ways by biology and technology. But this is not always the case. Take the example of the albatross and the glider. Both of those are trying to reach maximal flying distances using minimal energy. And both of them has evolved effectively the same solution, a fixed wing that they use just to generate the same lift from a high position. And an albatross, in fact, unlike other birds, or unlike me as I hold my arms out like this, does not use its muscles to keep its wings straight. Instead, it's evolved a tendon which fixes its wings in position exactly like a fixed-wing glider that it then uses to coast for hundreds of miles. And so in this case, biology and technology have converged. And so my question as a neuroscientist is clearly, in the world of intelligence, how have the biological and the technological converged or differed in the ways they've chosen to solve the problems? So I'm going to start by being easy on artificial intelligence with the most robotic behavior humans might be able to show. So these are computers in the older sense of the word. These are people whose job was to sit there and perform calculations for people like astronomers. So there's a fun quote from John Napier, a mathematician in the 1600s, who said he had found ways by which the learned, who perchance may have plenty of pupils in computers, might improve logarithm tables. To translate that into something I might write in my own papers, if only I'd had a bit more compute, I might have been able to show a better result. And so in our modern age, we do not have people here sitting doing calculations in order to produce logarithm tables. We have a calculator, but both of them are in some very meaningful sense doing exactly the same thing. They sit there and, like you learn in primary school, they go through the calculations of addition or multiplication or whatever it is and produce the same answer using the same sequence of steps. And so the argument here is in some very meaningful sense, they are doing the same algorithm. And we can push this further. Underlying, on the one hand, computers, we have the circuitry that implements that algorithm. So in a computer, this is, on the base is a transistor, which is a gate that allows current to flow on the basis of another input. And you wire enough of these together, and you get, for example, this breadboard that can perform addition, or you get your phone or your computer. And there's one crucial difference that we're going to highlight between this and our own systems, is that the computer, the von Neumann architecture, is famous for separating processing and memory. So there's the CPU, which performs the addition of numbers, for example, and separate from that, there's the hard drive that stores, for example, the numbers that you're going to add, or the program you use to add. So here's our summary of computers, which is the live computation is happening in electrical activity, the processing unit here is the transistor, and you have something like a memory stored in a hard drive. And on the brain side, we have neurons. So this is a neuron. It's a specialized cell type you have in your body. It's the entirety of your nervous system, and it creates all of your conscious perception and experiences. And all it is a cell that takes in, it's an electrically active cell that takes in inputs from all of its neighbors, integrates them, makes some decision about how active to be, and communicates that decision downstream. And on the left, what you're seeing is imaging of a small part of a mouse's brain that has been genetically engineered such that the neurons light up in a way that reflects their electrical activity. So you're seeing the live thinking patterns of a mouse. And by connecting them together, so this is a small part of mouse striatum, some of the lower level parts of the brain, by connecting together the neurons into circuits, you can do things a bit like the addition of numbers on the right-hand side on the breadboard. And so here we see another set of analogies. We have live computation, again, going on electrical activity in neuronal wires rather than metal wires. The processing unit here is the neuron, and memory is done through synaptic connections between neurons. There is no von Neumann architecture. There is no separation of processing and memory in the brain. They're all intermingled in the same circuitry. And so I think that gives us one difference you might point to between how the computers of old and the computers of new perform addition is that we're really bad at remembering things. And so unless you have specific, like very trained mnemonic skills, you're not able to perform addition with large numbers. Instead, you use paper. And so here we have, like, you could point to this being one difference here. The external hard drive is instead replaced by the piece of paper you use to add things together. Now, the point is not that we are calculators. You could go through all kinds of differences. There might be ways in which actually they are not doing the algorithm I told you they were doing. For example, you probably memorized that 2 plus 8 and 7 plus 3 are all, they add up to 10. You don't need to think through that and add them carefully in the same way a calculator would. You use these mental tricks, you get bored, you get tired, you daydream about stuff while you're doing maths. You know whether to check whether a number is reasonable or not. There's many, many ways in which these are different, and you could spend careers trying to work out how can you program a calculator to look more like a human, how can you behave more robotically to be a better computer. But that's not a very useful exercise. The one that I am going to say is useful is to point to one particular distinction between these two types of computers, and that is how they're wired up. How have they connected their circuits in order to perform addition? So on the one hand side, we have the animate, like us, and we have learned either through development, so for example, a giraffe emerges from the womb able to run within minutes, or through extensive practice, or through direct instruction, for example, in school, you're able to configure your circuits to do something like addition. On the other hand, traditional artificial intelligence, like old school computers, this is done entirely through instruction. This is what coding is. You sit there and you write a discrete set of instructions that the computer then follows in order to perform whichever algorithm you want it to. And this is not new. These are the computer codes of the 1800s that people used to configure looms to program certain fabrics. And so, yeah, all of it is just computer programming in some sense. And that is not a limitation. Both of these are universal computers and they can do anything. And this is encapsulated by this von Neumann quote. You insist that there is something that a machine cannot do. If you will tell me precisely what it is that a machine cannot do, then I can always make a machine which will do just that. This is making the point that if you're able to tell me cleanly enough that you can write it down as a sequence of steps, what it is you want this thing to do, that's it. You've got the code. You can make the computer do it. And this is the crucial distinction I'm trying to make between the types of algorithms we're talking about, is the hard problem becomes describing precisely what it is you want the computer to do. And so sometimes this is easy, and it's easy in some surprising places. So take the example of chess. This is Deep Blue, which was IBM's computer, which was famously used to beat the world's chess champion in the 1990s. And chess is an arena in which machines have far outpaced the best humans long ago. And how does it work? In the 1990s, it worked exactly through that, telling a machine how to do things. So they sat there and they coded up centuries of wisdom about how chess works, and they gave them strategies to use, and they gave them opening gambits, and they allowed the machine to search through 200 million board evaluations a second, and at times during the game, it was searching 20 moves deep into the tree of possibilities in a way that clearly Garry Kasparov was not capable of. And so this is the traditional way of doing computing, and this does not look much like us. Compare that to vision. So here is a famous, in the AI community, abstract from the early era in the 60s, where a summer project is proposed for some visiting students at MIT that says, this summer vision project is an attempt to use our summer workers effectively in the construction of a significant part of a visual system. This is something that still has not been done. No one has worked out how it is that I'm able to look out in the audience and recognize people. They do not know what sequence of steps is happening to turn pixels into the meaning that I assign to it, for example, to people's faces. And so these, despite being posed as a summer project in the 60s, are still basically unsolved problems. No one knows how this happens. And so this paradox is encapsulated by this cartoon. When a user takes a photo, the app should check whether they're in a national park. And the coder says, sure, easy, GIS, look up, give me a few hours. And check whether the photo is of a bird. I'll need a research team in 5 years. So the basic idea is what is easy to precisely state in a manner that a computer can understand is very non-intuitive. And so this idea is called Moravec's paradox, which is that machines excel on some of the stuff that seems hardest to us, but we're not able to code them up to do things that are easy for us. And so this is actually, we're going to explore in a moment how this is no longer true for vision. You may have noticed that your phones are now able to recognize people in your photos, but it's still true in some surprising places. For example, robotics conferences still show robots folding laundry as one of the best examples of the cutting edge of robotics. And that's because we have not been able to, but you're much better than the world's best robots at folding laundry. Again, very surprising, I think. So, we can describe chess sufficiently well to make a computer play it. We cannot do that for something like recognizing faces, but AI is able to do this. How is this possible? This is the modern AI revolution, and it's done by not giving computers a sequence of code, but allowing the machine to learn its own sequence of code to perform. So here's a load of pictures of my younger brother. The label you have to go for here is Christopher. And here's a set of pictures of my elder brother. The label you have to go for here is Philip. And the way we do this in modern machine learning is you feed both of them into a big black box, which has a lot of control knobs on it. And you see how well it performs. And then all you do is you twiddle the knobs until you get better. So you measure the performance of the system, twiddle, 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 twiddle. It gets better slowly. You do gradient descent, this algorithm which is just decreasing error by twiddling knobs, and you end up with a system that's able to classify. And this derives from the point that it's easier often for us to state what exactly it is that we want the system to do. We can evaluate when a system is performing correctly in a way that we're not able to precisely say how to do the sequence of steps that we want to happen. And now, as you know, AI is able to recognize many, many things in images, is able to talk to you, is able to reason in ways that are incredibly impressive. But that didn't rely on us solving any of the underlying problems. We do not know how vision works. We do not know how language works in any meaningful sense, despite the fact that we have created systems that are able to do it. And so, this is a problem as a neuroscientist, because I'm interested in how things happen inside the black box. One surprising fact that comes out from this that did not have to be true is that the modern AI systems are in fact based on the brain. So again, here's our neuron, and here's a neuron model that was written down in the 1940s by someone called McCulloch and Pitts, who were first thinking about how to code up neural computation in computers, and they wrote down this very simplified model in which you take a sum of inputs, do some nonlinear operation to decide whether or not to activate, and then output a signal. And we talked about how you connect networks of neurons together to produce the brain and computation, and what's basically happened in the intervening century, perhaps, is we've built connectionist models, these models made of these simple neurons, and if we found the very surprising thing that if we make them big enough and train them large enough, we produce intelligence. So it did not have to be the case that the models that produced this were originally based on the brain, but it's true. And so this makes us, as we try and work out what's going on in our own mind and in artificial intelligence, it points to a clear question: how similar are the solutions that these two have learned? So this is your interim summary, so you can get back on board if I lost you, which is standard computing automates mental labor using precise sequences of instructions, and this produces often very non-human solutions to problems, such as the deep blue solution to chess. Machine learning, on the other hand, self-configures the circuit using the fact that we have an evaluation metric where we might not have a sequence of code we can follow. And this has produced modern AI, and surprisingly, that modern AI is very similar, was originally based on brain models. So the question we're going to try and answer in the second half is, in what sense have these two systems converged on the shared solutions, a bit like an albatross and a glider? So we're going to do two examples. One quickly will be vision. So I discussed before how we don't really understand vision. So one approach to this that people have long taken is maybe we can go and look inside the brain and understand how vision is working by looking at how it's implemented within us. So if you look at the brain, there's a sequence of visual areas that go from your eye. The eye sends information to the back of your brain, the occipital lobe here, V1, and then slowly climbs this hierarchy from V1, V2, V4. Don't ask where V3 is, I've never heard of that, to IT. And each of them in sequence is performing layers of processing. So if you look in V1, you find neurons tuned to edges. In V2, to shapes. In V3, they get struck together into objects, perhaps an ear. And then finally, at the higher level areas, they get stuck into a face, and you get facial recognition. So for example, if you put a person in a scanner and ask them to look at faces, a particular area of their brain called the fusiform face area will light up. And that's the area that if it's damaged, you get the very odd condition, prosopagnosia, where you're not able to recognize faces. And so this is the case from the famous book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. And this is the very counterintuitive way in which vision is working because it's not consciously accessible to us. This person was still able to see, he doesn't bump into objects, he can recognize other objects, but he's not able to perform the operation of sticking together the features that make up your brother's faces and recognize who they are from those features. And I think it's very counterintuitive, and no philosopher before this empirical discovery had guessed that that was how our visual perception works. But it turns out it is. The very earliest neural network models, because of the amount of neuroscience that had been developed on vision, were based on exactly this system. And so very, very early on, they were coding up neural network models that do these iterated layers of processing. And if you look inside these models, trained to do object recognition, you find similar iterated layers of processing. These images I'm showing are the images that most excite a neuron at a given layer through the processing stack that happens. So early on, you get neurons tuned to edges. Later on, they get constructed into corners and objects before finally turning into objects that look a bit like cars or dogs. So in some sense, it does seem like they've converged on a similar layered feature extraction architecture. But this is only partly true, and one of the ways that we can see this is the following example. On the left is an image of a panda, and this model, on the bottom you're seeing the model's classification, which correctly says, like recognizing a younger from older brother, it says this is a panda with 60% confidence. Then you add a small amount of noise, and after adding the noise, you get the image on the right. To us, there is no perceptual difference between these two images. But to the model, it says with 99% confidence that is a gibbon. And why it's doing this, it appears that these models use texture a lot in a way our visual system never would, and that colored noise is disrupting its representation of texture that it's learned to relate to panda. And so clearly, this is like an illusion for us, but it's the machine illusion is that it looks a lot at texture and shows us the ways in which the systems are working very differently. So what have we learned from this exercise on vision is that in one sense they're similar, in one sense they're different, and I think the problem of using this as the paradigmatic example of comparing the two intelligences is that we never understood vision in the first place. So it's a bit hard to do the comparison between the two. So I'm a simple man, I'm going to try a simpler problem and see if we can make more progress. The problem that I've spent a lot of time thinking about is the neural basis of navigation, and I think this story is the most beautiful story neuroscience has yet discovered about the neural basis of our understanding of the world. And so the very precise problem we're going to be talking about is the following. Let's say you start at the house at the bottom here and do a sequence of steps, west, north, east, to some location, and then you realize you need to be back here for the next talk or something like that. You, despite the fact you've never been in this world before, you know the structure of 2D space, so you can do a clever thing. You can stand up the top there and have a think and be like, if I am where I am now and I take a step south, I can predict in the future, I can consider the hypothetical that I will then get back home. And so I can take a path I've never taken before and take a step south to return immediately through a shortcut. And the neural basis of this is the following. What I'm going to show you is this video. Yeah. Okay, so what's happening here? There's a square room. There's a rat running around in it, and this rat has an electrode inside it. The gray paths are the paths the rat takes as it runs around. And what the experimenters are doing is they're measuring a single neuron in the medial interrhinal cortex in the brain, and they're plotting a red dot every time this single neuron fires. So this is not a response to stimuli coming in. This is not a response to the motor actions of the animal. This is a latent code, and it's a latent code that encodes where the animal is in the room. So already that's impressive, but more impressive yet than that is the fact that it's not just a simple coding of space. Instead, this single neuron fires in a lattice of positions in the room. So I think, A, this is like phenomenally beautiful. No one ordered this. When they measured it, they were shocked, and it won the Nobel Prize in 2014. But I think B, clearly the question is what's going on? Why has the brain decided to create this hexagonal coding of space? Okay, so I'm going to talk you through the structure of this code slightly more. This is the most technical part, so bear with me. What I just described to you was a grid cell. So here's another representation of the grid cell. Again, gray parts, animal moves around, black dot you put down when the neuron fires. A single neuron firing in a hexagonal lattice of positions. They come in structures called modules. A module is a set of grid cells who share the same receptive field, but translated. So these 6 neurons all have the same underlying lattice, but just shifted around. Not rotated, just translated around. And finally, there are multiple modules in one rat, and you have them too, something like 10 modules. So the whole structure of the code is, I'm going to schematize them like this. Here's a grid cell. Here's a module that might have an orange, a red, and an orange, a blue, and a green, and it will have something like hundreds to thousands of these neurons tiling the whole space. And then there'll be a handful, maybe 10 of these different modules. So that's the full structure. And from this, we can in fact work out what the circuit is doing and why the animal has this and how it underlies our ability to navigate. Biology uses grid cells to solve path integration. So here's how. The 2 things the system needs to do is first, it needs to tell you, where am I? And second, it needs to tell you, if I take this step, where will I be? So one way you might do it is you would have a neuron that encodes this position, this red position, and another neuron that encodes the blue position. They are called place cells. They're found in other parts of the brain, but they turn out not to be how biology does it, and this is for the following reason, is that place cells are very good for path integration. Why is that? Because if my red neuron is firing, I know where I am, and if I take the step north, I know that my blue neuron needs to fire. So I can solve the problem. If I step north, I just activate my blue neuron. The problem with this is it's very limited. You need a neuron for every position you're going to be in the world. And there are many, many positions, and so it's a very inefficient way to code space. An alternative is to have neurons that activate in multiple positions in the room. So these are multi-field place cells, also measured in another part of the brain, and they're very good for coding capacity, because now it's not one neuron for one position, it's one combination of neurons for each position, and there's many more combinations than there are single neurons. So you can code many more positions with the same set of neurons. The problem with this is illustrated by the arrows. Let's say you're in the positions where the red neuron activates and you step north. You don't know whether to activate the blue neuron or not. It's very contextually dependent, so working out what the next sequence of neurons to fire for your next position is nigh on impossible. And so the grid cell system solves these two, okay? It does the first with the easy path integration coming from the symmetry. So if the red neuron is firing, no matter which of the red neuron's firing fields you're in, you know that were you to step north, you need to activate the blue neuron, the one that has the same receptive field, the same pattern of activity in space, but translated one step north. But it does this using high coding capacity because it's not one neuron for one position, it's many neurons for each position. So it combines the benefits of both systems. So for example, you can while just from the fact that the red neuron is firing, you don't know where you are, you could be in any of the red fields. From the combination perhaps of the red neuron and maybe that green neuron on the far right, those uniquely fire only where the rat is now, so you know where you are. So there we go. That's the most intense part. You've just learned about the most beautiful part of neuroscience and why it exists. A very interesting thing is that this is all in rats I've been talking to you about, but people have measured them in humans, and in humans they're not just used when you navigate physical space, but they're used when you navigate conceptual spaces that have the same structure. So there's a few experiments that show this. One of them was this one where they showed participants birds whose neck and leg length varied parametrically to create a two-dimensional space of bird images. They were never shown these arranged in a two-dimensional space, but they just moved from one image to another, and they chose to construct a mental map of the two-dimensional space of images in their head that you could find evidence of this grid cell coding for. So this same system appears to be used to relate concepts together in a way that depends on two-dimensional space. So the big question, this is how biology does navigation. Do artificial networks do the same thing? Have we converged on the same solution to intelligence in this very particular case where we know what we mean? So the game is simple. You give a neural network a sequence of actions like step down, and you ask it to tell you where you get to, for example, the house, and you see what happens inside the neural network. So a few years before I started my PhD, people did this, and they measured tuning curves. So this is how much the neurons activate in every point in the room again. They look very promising. They look like grid cells. But they turned out to have some problems. Sorry, you can't see some of the background here. But the one on the left is a famous paper from DeepMind, who at the time in 2018 was the preeminent AI company in the world. And they presented this result in Nature, the best science journal in the world. Turns out what they were showing you was basically noise. They found a few neurons that looked like that, but when you look at the full population, they look much more amorphous, and when you do a statistical comparison, they are indistinguishable from noise. And so while the one on the right is square and not hexagonal for reasons that aren't clear. So this is not just to poke holes in other people's papers, but to say that using neural networks as a model of the brain is very difficult because though they're very powerful and you can make them do anything, like talk to you, they're very inscrutable. We don't know why they're doing what they're doing. And so you can present a paper that says, look, we have rediscovered the biological solution to navigation, and in fact, you're tricking yourself. You did not just discover that. You discovered something that looked a bit like it if you squint the right way. So my work is trying not to do that. I try and do mathematical theories that tell you when and why grid cells should arise in optimal neural networks. So I don't know, I had never linked it to Aristotle before, but there was a lot of discussion of telos and goal that was coming on before. My work is directly in that line, I would argue. If Aristotle had been a scientist now, I would have asked him to predict from his theory of feet what animals should and should not have feet, and he hopefully would have seen the error in his ways of that argument. And I do similar things where I try and say, optimally, I think the goal of this system is to navigate, and therefore it should look a certain way. So we can derive constraints that say under what conditions should or should not you produce those grid cells. And people have since used these ideas to train neural networks that do robustly produce grid cells in a way that previous work was not able to. And so in this case, we have at least managed to answer the question of when and why do the solutions of neural networks and biological intelligence converge to the same albatross-type gliding structure. Yeah, and broadly, it's the shared pattern of constraints provided by the problem and by the architecture of doing it with a neural network that leads us to the same solution. Okay, let me wrap up. Why should we care about any of this? There's some very precise things you can do. For example, maybe you're wondering, why has the biology chosen these particular lattices with this particular angle between the two things? That's the kind of question, if you wonder about optimality, you can answer. You can be like, I think that should be about 4 degrees, and you can go back and check in measurements that never checked this before, and you can see that that's true. And I think it's very fun that you can do maths in your bedroom and then go back to measurements made inside the brains of rats running around rooms and make precise quantitative predictions that are true. And also, this was framed for navigation. I told you about this for navigation, but the idea is much more general. It's about using the logic of which algorithm you think the circuit is implementing to reason about the activity that you measure while the brain is doing that. So I've used similar things to reason about the representations at the front of your brain for task and the representations in large language models of concepts. We're looking for mathematical principles to map algorithms to neural underpinnings. I did them in grid cells. And if we understand the algorithm, the hope is we can understand the circuitry. And I think this points to a Moravec's paradox type idea in neuroscience, is that in the cases where we can understand the algorithm, where we can precisely pin down the sequence of steps that's required, this kind of framework can help us understand the neural underpinnings. That seems more likely to be true in the front of the brain that does cognitive and harder for us things than it does for something like vision. Vision remains a black box that has not opened because we suddenly have models that are able to do it. And so in some cases we have a model, in some cases we still don't, like robots folding laundry. I think I'm going to skip the one where I talk about philosophy, which already seemed dodgy, and I'll just stop there. So, thank you very much.